Hey everyone, before we start today's episode, I wanted to quickly tell you about the membership drive that I am doing on patreon.com/FireTheseTimes to celebrate over 2 years of this podcast. If we hit the goal of 100 new supporters at $5 or more a month or $50 a year, I'll be able to hire a producer, which would give me more time to focus on the research and interviews and actually start releasing 2 episodes a week instead of 1. If you become a supporter, in addition to getting early access to all episodes, you will also have access to our monthly hangout, in which myself and everyone else who supports this project come together and chat about pretty much everything. It happens every month on a Saturday, and you have access to the link and everything related to that on Patreon. And lastly, if you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing this podcast with your friends and families and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. This helps get more exposure to this podcast and introduce it to more folks. You can also follow this podcast and project on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Substack, and of course the main website. So thanks again everyone, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Let's just start with some introductions on your part, if that's okay.
Okay, so my name is Dana El-Kurd. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Richmond in the Department of Political Science. Yeah, that's what's important about me, I guess.
Well, it's your second time on the podcast, so I'm guessing some of the listeners have already listened to the previous one, which was on what was the title of the previous one? Authoritarianism.
Legacies of Authoritarianism or something. Yeah.
Yes, Legacies of Authoritarianism in Palestine, something along those lines. Thanks. I've done so many episodes, I don't remember titles, and I think at this point, who cares?
You've done a lot. Yeah.
Okay, let's contextualize a bit what we're going to talk about. Give us sort of like a relatively quick summary of what the paper is about, just to contextualize it for listeners, although obviously they can read the description and the title, and I'll continue from there on. I have some comments already.
Yeah, so basically the paper is trying to put the focus on pro-Palestine activism, and saying that this kind of activism, in the Arab world is often underlooked as a major kind of motivator of anti-authoritarianism in the region. So I show how, using kind of the Qatari case, but I think this applies more broadly, I show how pro-Palestine activism has 3 particular impacts, which we can get into, about introducing activists to the idea of political agency, citizenship building, and these spillover effects that I talk about in the paper. And basically, it generates these kinds of demands, not only on the issue of Palestine, but on the idea of democratic decision making and accountability and their people's ties to each other across the region. So basically, my punchline is that this sort of activism is often unrecognized as a major driver of opposition, but I think it's crucial in a lot of cases. It's just ignored for a variety of reasons, again, which we can get into.
Yeah, no, we're definitely going to get into this. I just want to say before we kind of do, as it happens, we're recording this on March 30th, 2022, obviously. And as it happens, the timing is quite extraordinary. I don't tend to plan these things, you can testify, but we are recording this on this date, and as it happens, in the past couple of two weeks-ish, we've had 2 relatively major events, although in some ways they're overblown, but they are major, at least for the purpose of our conversation, which is Bashar al-Assad visiting the UAE and being basically treated as just another regular ruler in the Arab world, which says a lot about the Arab world. And more recently, 2 days ago or something, the so-called Negev Summit, which included Egypt, Morocco, Bahrain, the UAE, the Americans, obviously Israel, but no Palestinians. I want to kind of almost time-stamping this, because I think that this in and of itself, the fact that these 2 happen quite close to one another already says a lot. But let's just spin this for now. Okay, so you list these 3 mechanisms that link the Palestinian cause and anti-authoritarianism. So I'll just read them out first. The Palestinian cause introduces activists in their formative years to the idea of political agency, provides a space to engage in citizenship building practices, and thirdly, generates spillover effects in the development of activists as well as in civil society more broadly. Can you sort of walk us through these things a bit?
Yeah, so let's start with the first mechanism about kind of political agency in formative years. So there's a lot of research in kind of political psychology and stuff related to like legacies of authoritarianism that looks at what's happening in an individual's formative years between the ages of 15 and 25 and how that might have a kind of long-term impact on their political opinions and values. So my argument in this paper is that a lot of these young folks who are getting involved in pro-Palestine activism, again, I'm talking about the Qatari context, but I think that this travels. They are exposed to different kind of discourse. They're exposed to different kinds of processes. So they're introduced to this idea that, oh, actually, we can influence national policy on Palestine, and not just Palestine, transnational politics, like our ties with the Palestinians. And they can't really obfuscate the nature of this in the sense that like this is not pro-Palestine groups are not like professional associations or humanitarian organizations necessarily or like social groups. It's this fundamentally political thing. So because it's this fundamentally political thing, it kind of leads activists on this, logical conclusion that okay, I'm not happy with what's happening in Palestine, which is it's a political problem. It's not an issue of like just not getting enough humanitarian aid to Palestinians. Like this is a political problem. So we're making demands of our state to not perpetuate the status quo in Palestine. So this is making a political demand. And then when they kind of succeed in getting the state to react to them or in like generating some interest among society, then they realize that like they do have this sense of political agency. They can impact what the state does and how the state responds to them, that they're not just, I call it like acquiescent recipients of policy. And then the second mechanism is about this citizenship building practice. So like I have this whole spiel in the paper about like the public sphere in the Arab world and what does it mean to practice citizenship. So a lot of times, or the way that civil society has been conceived of and public sphere has been conceived of in the Arab world by like Western scholars is to look at it in kind of narrow terms, or look at just like official NGOs or, particular forms of civil society that are maybe very,
Very narrow.
very narrow, but also like easily viewed. Like they have offices and they have whatever. And those kinds of official types of civil society, they're not playing the role that civil society plays in like democratic states. They're not having this impact of like building this sense of citizenship amongst their members or amongst the people that they service. Whereas in highly repressive contexts like the Arab Gulf states, or particularly in Qatar, where these kinds of civil society groups are, there might be many official civil society groups, but again, they're not generating any kind of like sense of citizenship. What's the real spaces where that's happening are these more informal groups. And that's where pro-Palestine activism fits, is it's often informally organized. It's not officially sanctioned by the state. It doesn't have official registration by any ministry, more often than not, and particularly the groups that I talk about in the paper. So those informal spaces are where people are getting a sense of like, oh, we are actually citizens of the state. We're not subjects. We have a right to like shape the public discourse. We have rights owed to us by our governments. And I also tie it to this perception of like their role in the region and their ties to other people in the region as well. And so, citizenship in Qatar is not just because I'm a Qatari citizen in this narrow space, or, again, in any of these other countries that I'm talking about, but it's also these larger ties to an Arab nation across state borders. So yeah, that's the second component, and the last component has to do with this spillover effect that I noticed when I was doing this research. So people get started with pro-Palestine activism for a variety of reasons, but they get started in this group, and then these kinds of groups generate other dynamics across society and across civil society. Like the things that the things that are discussed in the pro-Palestine activism circles or in these kinds of groups go on to inform the generation of new groups and new discussions, and kind of gives activists involved, both like organizational training, but also development of like more radical ideas about like democratic values and their right to decision making in their country. And so I outlined some of the ways that happened in the Qatar case, where people started in Qatar Youth Against Normalization, but then opposed to normalization, sorry, and then they started new groups talking about Qatari identity and what kinds of identities the state is pushing and who is represented by the state, and like that's a much larger topic of conversation than Palestine would suggest, but that's where it's coming from.
Yeah. It's really important. I mean, number of things. For one, like just off the bat, it contradicts, or at least it challenges the usual way, or I don't know if it's, I mean, yeah, I think it is usual. It's definitely a common way of framing, quote unquote, the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is that there are Arabs on one side, there are Israelis on the other side, and obviously the Arabs are all homogeneous and it's all the same thing. One thing that is very interesting about what we're talking about, and you mentioned it's, obviously the study is on Qatar, but I grew up in Lebanon, as everyone knows by now, and I had the same, very similar trajectory, even before I found out myself that I was part Palestinian, which is a story in and of itself. But it was at the times, obviously also the time in which I was growing up. In 2006, you had the war between Hezbollah and Israel. You had 2008, the war in Gaza, and then everything that happened after that. It was around that time that I started university, 2010 specifically. And obviously with the Arab Spring, then these two, the Palestinian cause and then the anti-authoritarian causes more broadly, essentially were linked almost organically. Before kind of reading the literature on the topic, before kind of becoming slightly more quote-unquote sophisticated on it during my studies and whatnot, it was just there. It was just part of the language, it's just part of the makeup, if you want, the cultural makeup, if you want, of the activist scene, at least in Beirut. What's interesting is that, as I said before, let me focus on Lebanon a sec. In Lebanon, I have been arguing for quite some time now that a core component of the Lebanese regime, which we can call the sectarian regime, is actually, I don't have a very good term for it, so I just call it anti-Palestinianism, maybe structural anti-Palestinianism if I want to be slightly more fancy about it. But essentially what it means is that what they use framing, like not this exact language because I'm speaking in English here, but like the Palestinian question, quote unquote, in Lebanon is seen as inherently a political question that is directly linked to sectarianism. So it's not like we, the Lebanese, have sectarianism, and also we have the Palestinians, and we need to deal with this, quote unquote. The anti-Palestinianism in Lebanon manifests itself in different ways. Most Palestinian refugees in Lebanon are Sunnis, that's just a demographics thing. And so whenever you have any kind of talks around the topic of Palestinian rights in Lebanon, Palestinian right to remain in Lebanon, and let alone, obviously, naturalization, which is the case in my family, although that was a minority, most obviously did not get naturalized in Lebanon. All of those are treated as inherently as problems. You know, they're not seen as a humanitarian concern or even defending the Palestinian cause against the Israelis. Like you would have people who would say in the same sentence, we must fight for Palestinian rights against the Israelis. We must oppose the Israelis. But Palestinians in Lebanon shouldn't get too cozy. Like those two things cohabitate in many people's minds in Lebanon, which is one of the many things that people don't understand when they think about, again, anti-Israel, pro-Palestine, all of those buzzwords. They can provide some kind of reality. Sorry?
Like the reality that manifests for Palestinians.
Exactly.
Like, can be very different. Yeah.
Exactly. And the reason why, and maybe in Syria it's actually more clear than in case of Lebanon, because Lebanon is relatively emphasis on the term more democratic than Syria, which isn't saying much because Syria is not democratic at all. But you have some degree of freedom of speech. To some extent, you can say more stuff, at least to some extent, that you would in the rest of the Arab world, more or less, with some caveats here and there. In Syria, famously or infamously, I don't know, you have the Palestinian flag that's sometimes flown alongside the Syrian one. The Ba'athist flag is obviously pretty much identical. You would have one of the Mukhabarat branches. It's called the Palestine branches. You have a number of symbolic representations, if you want, that if you don't know much of what's happening, you would conclude, oh, well, this is a pro-Palestine government, obviously. Like, this is a government that clearly is on the side of Palestinians. Then obviously you go into the details, the fact that there are no rights in Syria in the first place, whether you're Palestinian or not, in terms of democratic representation. And then obviously you get into the darker side of things, especially since 2011, with the bombing of Yarmouk, the siege of Yarmouk, and so on and so forth. And so then the picture then becomes, okay, well, clearly this is a government, an authoritarian government that uses pro-Palestine language, and unfortunately it still works on some people. But for the most part, it's there for that sake. But then there are limits to that. Like, even in the context of Egypt, although under Sisi much less so, you would have expressions of pro-Palestine solidarity, let's say, that would be tolerated from time to time. You would have occasionally, you know, at least statements would be allowed. When it gets to the point of we're going to protest for Palestine, that's when it can be a bit complicated, because any kind of protest can lead people to think, well, we can do this for Palestine, why can't we do this for ourselves, for Egypt, for Syria, you know, and whatnot. And regimes clearly crack down on this. Make that nuance for us, if that's okay, so I don't just keep rambling forever.
No, yeah, I agree with you, and I kind of want to touch on 2 points. Is that, like, what I talk about in the Qatari case is an interesting one because it's often seen as such a, like, completely controlled environment.
Yeah.
And so my, like, part of talking about this is to say, even in these kind of highly controlled environments, this is the role that Palestine plays in generating all these impacts and generating kind of an anti-authoritarian discourse and outlook, political outlook. But it's not just Qatar. We have, like, these experiences, as you said, in Egypt, where, okay, there is sometimes tolerated, like, you know, they allow for people to express anger about what's happening in Palestine in very kind of controlled situations, but they 100% know what what pro-Palestine activism can lead to and what it sometimes is covering up for. So in the Egyptian case, like, you know, the first kinds of, like, after Sadat comes to power and starts to pursue kind of steps towards normalization with Israel, and particularly following that, we see activists become, you know, organizing themselves around the Palestine issue that later transforms into demanding accountability for, you know, Egyptian regime's foreign policy under Mubarak, that later transforms to, like, same people transforms to demanding, like, you know, no hereditary succession under Mubarak's regime. So, like, you can't bring Jamal Mubarak after you, and, like, that's what, you know, kind of the initiation of even the whole Arab Spring uprising is coming from that. So it's not just kind of like an ideological progression, but it's also just like an organizational and logistic kind of capacity building that's, you know, pro-Palestine activism and these moments around Palestine, whether it's the first or second Intifada or whatever, that is generating this kind of thing down the line. So people who first come to a protest during the second Intifada then go on to join Kifaya and then go on to protest the entire Egyptian regime in 2011. And as you said, like, sometimes Palestine has been, you know, used by certain regimes in the region because they are so vacuously illegitimate, and, you know, some of them claim Arab nationalism or whatever, and but haven't been able to achieve any of the things that Arab nationalism promises in terms of a state for the Arab nation or a civic nation or any of these things. So, you know, you have to use your supposed support of the Palestinian cause to, like, grant you any kind of legitimacy. And as you said, it works on some people. Unfortunately, even people who are not living under these regimes, so they don't really have any excuse. But and that kind of gives us the impression that, like, this kind of activism can be distorted. And this kind of activism doesn't necessarily need to follow the trajectory that I outline in the piece. So I do want to caveat that here, that pro-Palestine activism doesn't always go in this direction. But I'm saying the potential is there, which is why the Syrian regime puts so much effort into trying to monopolize the discourse around Palestine.
Yeah.
Why the Egyptian regime allowed for some shows of pro-Palestine solidarity just to try to, alleviate people's anger for a moment. And why the Jordanian regime, for example, there's a new book out recently about this as well, allows pro-Palestine protests in very specific spaces in the city. So there's a reason, because they know that when you start thinking clearly about this, you see that these things are connected. So if you can obfuscate, if you can monopolize the conversation, if you can claim to be the legitimate representative of pro-Palestinianism, then you can try to get away from the threats of pro-Palestine activism.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's this brilliant, there's this concept of tanfis, which when I interviewed Sharia Talerani on Syrian prison literature and the poetics of human rights, that's the title of the episode. If people listening want to check that one out. And so because she talks about it in her book, which is again on Syrian prison literature. And in summary, tanfis is, as a policy, tanfis, I don't know how to translate tanfis, but it's I think of a balloon and you let the air out from the balloon. That's how I think tanfis.
Yeah, like hot air being let out.
Yeah, like you're getting rid of air, I guess, something like that. We have this expression like fashit khila, I guess that's another one, but that doesn't help with the translation here. It essentially regimes would occasionally allow relatively critical voices as a way to let off some steam, quote unquote. And also by doing this seeming almost less authoritarian, look, we're letting you do some stuff, so don't ask too much. Don't rock the boat too much. And obviously, even in this context, even in context where, as we mentioned now, where you are allowed to maybe wave a Palestinian flag or burn an Israeli one maybe, or chant anti-Israel stuff or pro-Palestine, slogans usually would be allowed, not usually, but in some contexts would be allowed. But the limitations would be, well, stick to there. Talk about it there. Don't talk about, in the case of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan even, but especially Lebanon, Syria. I mean, at least I can speak to those two more. Don't ask about Palestinian rights in Syria, or Lebanon. Don't go too far, essentially. And
or we're complicit in it.
Exactly. I mean, with Egypt, it's so straightforward with Egypt, obviously, because the blockade of Gaza, and it's just one of those things where you are allowed to, again, under Sisi, not so much. Before that, you were allowed to do certain things, but don't talk too much about the blockade. Don't say that, well, maybe we're kind of in it as well. There are certain lines that you cannot cross. In Lebanon, and I don't want to focus too much on Lebanon because I do this all the time, but it does confuse if a lot of people, I feel, even I'm putting aside tankies and whatever because they won't listen to this anyway, but well-meaning people, honestly, are genuinely confused. Or just maybe don't know enough, and that's fine. We can all learn stuff. It's not a problem. But they think of the main parties, if they have heard of them. Usually they've only heard of Hezbollah and maybe a couple of the others, and they think, okay, it's either the government or not the government or whatnot. But then they would see things that, well, protests are allowed from time to time. Pro-Palestine protests are indeed allowed from time to time. It's generally okay to wave Palestinian flags in the context of a pro-Palestine protest. And burning Israeli flags and whatnot, no one is going to say anything about this in Lebanon since Israel bombed Lebanon 1,000 times. These things aren't crossing the line. What crosses the line is when, for example, time is very blurry now, but I think this was in 2019, or 2018 or 2019, there was quite a significant protest movement in Lebanon by Palestinians and supporters and Lebanese who support Palestinian rights. Essentially against discrimination, against repression, against all of these things, and that was pretty brutally repressed. That is the same government that, in another context, on the news, you don't see Israel. If you have the Weather Channel, you would see Palestine. You have all of those symbolic things where, if you're just following the rhetoric that is sort of being pushed, and this includes, by the way, TV channels that are affiliated with parties that historically were not really anti-Israel. Either were complicit during the occupation, or at the very least, that's kind of based on another focus. Even on those channels, they kind of pay lip service to this because it's just not politically feasible to be pro-Israel in Lebanon for now.
Right.
Whether that changes eventually, who knows? And so this is the nuance that kind of gets lost. And you see it especially when, or at least I would see it especially when, during the uprising, the October 2019 and a few months after that, until the pandemic uprising, you would have a few, not that many, but you have a few Palestinian flags among the Lebanese flags. Most of the time, or a lot of the time, it's like fine, no one says anything, and some people are even for it and whatnot. But other times you will see like the odd comment or the odd stare, or sometimes someone tells you like, this isn't about Palestine, this isn't about Lebanon. And in the media, even in media that is again nominally pro-Palestine, you would see the same tropes. For example, OTV, which is the Free Patriotic Movement's channel, would use the same tropes against Palestinians that they would use against Syrians. So jihadis, foreigners, foreign agents, blah, 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 etc., etc. And that's the exact same channel that maybe like an hour later would have a report on the bad stuff that the Israelis are doing against Palestinians. As long as you focus over there and not over here, essentially. It's really that's straightforward. So I guess the question would be, and maybe this is a bit of a difficult one, how do we make the difference between when is it tanfis, as we're calling it now, and when is it, let me see how to ask this. Like, when is a state, and maybe this is, yeah, okay, let me know if this doesn't make sense. But when is a state allowing pro-Palestine protests because they feel like it benefits them? And when are they doing it because they feel like if they don't allow it, they are at risk?
Okay, I see what you're saying. You're basically saying when is it tanfis and when is it actually like a legitimate, show of kind of resistance to regime discourse or politics. I mean, I think it is a difficult one because it's always much, much easier answered in hindsight. But at the same time, it's also, I don't think that there is this binary. I think that sometimes regimes engage in tanfis and things slip from them.
Yeah.
And sometimes regimes try to, harness the legitimacy of allowing these kinds of groups and things slip from them. And so they also have to be very careful. And sometimes today or in 2010 or whatever, it acts as tanfis and then the next iteration of activists builds on it and it's no longer tanfis. Yeah. So for me, I like to think of it as kind of an iterative process. As long as it's, not completely co-opted, like very clearly co-opted, it always poses that risk. And that's the fire that they play with. So like in the Qatari context, we could easily see how the Qatari regime might want to harness this kind of activity to lend legitimacy to itself. So there are like organizations that emerge in Qatar that have ties to like certain ministries that talk about Palestine and bring Palestinian speakers and wave the flag and wear the keffiyeh and like raise money for humanitarian aid and all of this, right? And that clearly fits the image that the Qatari state wants to give to some segments of the Arab population across the region. But then not all of it, right?
Yeah.
You still have Qatar youth opposed to normalization. And okay, nobody's sticking them in prison, but they're not following the line. And they're making these very explicit political demands and they're directing their demands to the state itself. So the attempts by the regime to try to harness this concept of like, or the pro-Palestinian cause can only work to a limit is what my point is. So I think that this is the case in other places too. Like it may, we saw like in Syria, like prior to the revolution, like, yeah, they would allow protests, but people were coming to those protests with very different ideas about what those protests meant. And then we did have a revolution in Syria. I'm not saying there's like a direct causal link, but it's, what's the term? It has an impact. It's like pro-Palestine activism is a threat multiplier. Like we talk about climate change, it's a threat multiplier. And they can never really control fully the impact that will have. Because Palestine is such a clear situation of settler colonialism. It's a clear situation of injustice and has this, is tied so much with like anti-authoritarian and anti-colonial struggle in the region. So it's difficult to circumscribe it in the way that these regimes want.
Yeah, I mean, it's older for one. It's older than all of those regimes for that matter. So like there is that component to it for sure. And I randomly thought of, not random, it's in the context, but there was a video of there was the Arab Cup, whatever, in Qatar. And they had all of those, which is a very Arab thing, and it annoys me all the time. It's very cheesy. You have all of the anthems, one after the other, and everyone pretending to be emotional about this. And you would
To be
have
honest, it hit me. It hit me a little.
like, you're supposed to be nostalgic for something. I don't know what, but whatever. And so they were singing. There was 3 of them, I think. And then at some point, the Palestinian one, the Palestinian anthem, they sung it again. It's like 2 or 3 verses per whatever. People can look it up. I don't recommend it. It's very boring. But so they were very like almost like deferential, like, oh, we're doing this out of respect. And then what's kind of funny is funny. I don't know if funny is the word. It's like مضحك مبكي, as we say. Like, it's funny, but it's not funny. It's sad. But like, you have all of those other anthems, including the anthems of those very same regimes that are either normalizing with Israel or blockading Gaza with Israel, or have murdered Palestinians in the case of Syria, etc., etc. And obviously the fact that there was the Assad regime's flag was notable for many of us. And so it's like, well, this is the extent in which, in the context of Qatar, this would be allowed, at least when it's filmed, right? Like when it's, it's like, okay, we can have the flags. Whoever's gonna protest or whatever, we won't see it, or probably they won't do it. But it's like, it's not too visible. It's not too obvious in the sense that you didn't have like the Israeli flag and the Israeli national anthem. That would be too obvious, obviously, and they wouldn't do it because it's the Arab Cup anyway. But you would have, like, as long as you stick to a certain script, and this script is like the recycled pan-Arab / in some cases pan-Islamist / I don't know what 2.0. It's very hollow at this point. It's like the slogans and with all of the criticisms that I have towards old school pan-Arabism, which I do, but that's not the point here. It's like, at the very least, there were some things that it was about. And there was
more called out now, yeah.
Yeah, there was something, some good or bad, whatever. But there was something that they were talking about, thinking about, fighting for, even in some cases. Right now, at this point, it's like, it's just recycling the best hits in many ways without doing much about it. I'm making this here link because I always do, but also because I've noted, and I didn't know this until a few years ago, really, but a lot of also Syrian activist friends also started, really, as you mentioned as well, before 2011, if they're of a certain age, being pro-Palestine activists, because as long as you don't rock the boat too much, that's sort of tolerated in Syria. It was before 2011, obviously. And within that space of tolerance, like, let's say a picture, and I know this, that it happened, I've spoken to some people who participate in these things, it's like you organize some kind of salon, some kind of exhibition, some kind of, I don't know, encounter, cultural encounter at some cafe or what have you, on the topic of the Palestinian cause. And under such a topic, it can be tolerated, it could be allowed. And through those discussions, because these discussions wouldn't be live streamed, they wouldn't be live tweeted, obviously, back then. It's just a group of people who came together to talk about these things. In such a space, you're sort of allowed, or you were in some cases allowed, to sort of say more than you would if you were chanting what you were saying down the street, for example. And there is a direct link here. Like, I know I've interviewed Wafa al-Mustafa, for example, and she told me towards the end of that episode, I remember that, like, her name is actually named after the Palestinian Media Agency, because her father but like when he was younger, he was very active in like pro-Palestine stuff in Syria. And this influenced him when the revolution happened. This sort of inspired him. And in many ways, as Wafa herself said, they didn't see, like, they were not, because the propaganda was of a certain nature in the context of Syria, they were not led to believe that there was actually a contradiction between being pro-Palestine and being pro-democracy or pro-freedom or pro-what have you, because supposedly that's what the Palestinian cause was always all about. And so it's like, as you said, tanfis would be allowed, but the regimes wouldn't necessarily have a control over, the end results, like spillover, as you said.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
So just back to the Gulf a bit. Although you focus on Qatar, the main example that I know of very relatively vocal pro-Palestine activism in the Gulf would be the context of Bahrain. Mm-hmm. And in Bahrain, Bahrain, for those who don't know, I haven't done a Bahrain episode yet. I will at some point. But Bahrain also went through its own version of the Arab Spring, a pretty sizable revolution in 2011 that was very brutally crushed, notably with the help of Saudi tanks. But even with that repression, we still have, to this day, I saw one not that long, a few months ago, Bahraini activists protesting, or at least having some kind of protest, whether on the streets or online, against normalization with Israel. That tends to be the topic these days because it's happening, basically. How have you seen, if not Bahrain specifically, but how can you, let me see how to ask this. I don't want this to just be a repetition of when is it tanfiz, when is it not tanfiz.
But, you mean like how does it travel to other places?
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, how would if what you've seen in Qatar, how can you see it traveling elsewhere? Or how has it traveled elsewhere?
Yeah. Can I just comment quickly on what you said about the Syria situation too?
Yeah.
And some of the other things we've been discussing, and then I'll definitely answer this question about how I'm seeing it in different places, because this paper is about Qatar, but it's emerging out of this larger project that does compare this across a number of different Arab Gulf states. So I'm working on that component. So I have thoughts on that. But I just want to clarify also that like the way that we've been discussing how pro-Palestine activism masks further issues that people might have with the regime. Sometimes people are using this instrumentally, right? Like they are doing pro-Palestine activism. Obviously, they do care about Palestine. I'm not saying they don't, but they know instrumentally, kind of from an organizational, viewpoint, this is the way to start building some movement, and very clearly, again, instrumental.
Yeah.
But then other people, like my argument, kind of goes beyond that instrumental explanation of like how pro-Palestine activism leads to these kinds of movements. I'm basically like one activist basically told me that. Foreign policy isn't just a proxy to express anger about domestic politics. For many people, it's that they're two sides of the same coin. That the issue is holistic. Their activism around Palestine is a continuation of the struggle in the past century of their activism towards colonial intervention, essentially, which they see as responsible for Israel as well as responsible for their own authoritarian regimes. So there's that kind of thing. Now, it's because, as I was trying to say earlier, maybe not as coherently, but it's because being pro-Palestinian makes you think of these linkages. Unless your pro-Palestinianism veers into chauvinism, unless all you care about is Palestine, and you're fine with certain regimes instrumentalizing you to get ahead.
Which we definitely see as well.
Which we absolutely see. But that is not a sustainable pro-Palestine movement in any shape or form.
Yeah.
And if you're truly like, because of the injustice of the situation, like you are pro-Palestinian, then you start to, as you learn more, you start to connect it to the regional dynamics. So I just wanted to like kind of maybe complicate the way that I was talking about it a little bit. Now, in terms of the question on like Bahrain and things like that, I think that Qatar is like what I call in the paper a hard case, just because it's such a small society and regular civil society is so well controlled. So it's like, how do you even see these same dynamics in like the hardest of cases? Now, Bahrain is less of a hard case. Yeah. Bahrain has organizations that were pro-Palestine offices and things like that, anti-normalization offices, since before Bahrain gained its independence as a state. And it has a very active civil society. Being pro-Palestinian is one of those topics in Bahrain that bridges divides.
Right.
And you see very clearly, and I have this in another paper that's currently under review, so hopefully it'll be published at some point. You see very clearly in the lead up to the Abraham Accords and the lead up to the official normalization, like peace agreement with Israel that Bahrain has signed, you see them, start to chip away at the space that pro-Palestine groups are allowed in Bahrain.
Right.
But because there is this history, they can only be so successful. Now, that I'm not saying that doesn't mean pro-Palestine activists in Bahrain are not struggling and that they do have repression and they have had their events shut down and stuff like that. That's all happened. But, they had to kind of really plan for it in advance in the lead up to this peace agreement. Like they passed a civil service bylaw that changed the civil service rules so that like anybody who has any ties to the government can't criticize Bahraini foreign policy. They they just tried to take steps to like circumscribe how much pro-Palestine groups would be able to organize following the Abraham Accords. And they were successful to some degree, but like they cannot shut it down completely, just because there is such a rich history in the Bahraini case. And I think that the similar dynamics of like generating spillover effects, involving people in their formative years, politicizing them, radicalizing them, all of that is happening in the Bahrain case as well. And then the two other cases that I looked at in this paper, not the paper we're talking about, but another paper was Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Yeah.
And there are different dynamics, of course, but still, like, pro-Palestine activism has been such a target of these regimes that are either under the table normalizing or just straightforwardly normalizing, like Bahrain and the UAE, because of its potential. Yeah. Like, we see it just clear as day.
Yeah, I mean, the Bahrain example is a good. We were talking before, like, what is the difference between when is it tanfis and when is it not? And you explained very well it's not a binary. But in the case of Bahrain, it's very obviously not even tanfis, because probably the regime understood that if they do allow any kind of, organizing in any kind of shape, way or form, this can be dangerous for Bahraini foreign policy, for their attempts to normalize, which they've done. Probably even for the regime itself, who knows? Like, basically, they definitely saw this as a threat. In the case of the Saudis and Emiratis, I don't know it as much. The only thing I know about the Emiratis is the case of Ahmad Mansour and how his phone was hacked using, or at least with the help of Israeli software, so that we knew even before the noise around the Abraham Accords that the UAE and Israel were already exchanging technology and whatnot. And I mean, this isn't the secret at this point. There are lots of very good articles on the topic. So like that is the thing. With the Saudis, it's for me, I think the way I've interpreted it is that they do have a sizable civil society, or at least a sizable, quite a lot of people who are, activists, I would say, intellectuals on various topics. Women's rights would be the obvious one, Loujain, a number of others. Or different issues within Saudi Arabia as well. I don't actually know, so I don't know if you can elucidate on this, like how, where would Saudi Arabia and the UAE, because I didn't say much about the UAE, where do they fit in this conversation, since we're kind of on the topic of the Gulf anyway?
Yeah, so let's start with the UAE. So like these kinds of like linkages between, like authoritarian linkages between Israel and the Emirati government, like obviously manifests in like the clear examples we have with the Ahmad Mansour case and stuff like that. But the UAE also has had a history of more Islamist, like more kind of, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, like I just, just as an identification, they're more Islamist groups that are focused on the Palestinian issue. And they had a committee against normalization. There was an early manifestation of it that was shut down in 2013, and now there's another one that has been regrouped in the exile. So all these Emirati exiles that have fled the UAE for a variety of reasons because of political repression have reformed the normalization committee. The anti-normalization committee. So in the UAE, I think that Palestine plays a similar dynamic. And that's why the UAE has been so maybe the most effective at just shutting it down. And it's been ongoing for quite some time. So I spoke with some Emirati activists, admittedly, like not as much as I spoke with like the Qatar activists, because I used to live in Qatar, and so it's a different breadth perhaps. But like Ala Siddiq, who recently passed away, she said that like, for some time, until there were kind of more recent changes in the Emirati direction, Palestine was very like integral to their education system. So it's something they grew up with in the family, in the school, they're a very conservative society. So kind of from the religious perspective, they're talking about Palestine. They would have like, pseudo protests on school property about Palestine and things like this. And a lot of like the people who were involved in calling for more representative government, again, many of them from like Islamist, like Islah groups, were also active on the Palestine front. But the UAE was maybe the most decisive across the Gulf in just nipping that in the bud really, really early. As I said, the Committee Against Normalization had its last meeting in 2013. Like, it was very clear, like, where the tides were turning. There was a counter-revolutionary push. Many of those people fled or were imprisoned with the UAE 94 case. And so I think the pro-Palestinian issue could have had the same potential in generating these kinds of discussions among Emiratis, but they were just very proactive. They were very proactive authoritarianism in the UAE. And the build up to the Abraham Accords, I think, has been going on for quite some time, which is ironic, by the way, because if you look at like Freedom House scores for the UAE versus Bahrain or the UAE versus Qatar, like, it does better. Like, you're more free in the UAE according to like these Western conceptions of freedom, but like, it's absolutely way more repressive. In Saudi Arabia, as you said, I almost feel bad comparing Saudi Arabia with some of the countries we're talking about, because Saudi Arabia is like, what is it, like 30 million people? Like, it's just like on a different plane,
It is, yeah.
Very diverse society, has a lot of civil society groups and things like this. But I think that there are similar dynamics in the sense that there is Saudi participation in the 1948 war. Like, some people like have that kind of memory. The Saudi regime itself used to encourage some level of like pan-Islamism and like, feeling for the Bosnians and feeling for the Afghans and sending people to Bosnia and sending people to Afghanistan. And Palestine was very integral to the school system. Like, so there's maybe they grow up with this kind of, discourse. And it's easy when you start becoming politicized around the issue of Palestine to start getting politicized about other things. Whether you go the Arab nationalist route, which many have done, I think we're probably have the same intellectuals in mind, or the Islamist route. Now, I was going to say one thing. The only thing I would say is that, particularly in the UAE case, I think that Palestine could have played this dynamic, but since it was so shut down effectively and so early, now there is kind of a fear that society will go the direction that governments are leading them, in the sense that like the Emirati regime is normalizing the state of Israel and playing this counter-revolutionary role in the region and selling this brand of authoritarianism, like this high-tech tolerant authoritarianism where you're surveilled from like, from the morning till night. And, there is this fear that like, because there isn't an alternative voice that's allowed at all in the UAE context, like that people might, imbibe these kinds of ideas, might become actually like, not just as a way to like, cheerlead for the government, but like actually Zionist or actually like pro-Israel. And there is a little bit of fear of that. And that's why you see the Emiratis in exile try to, organize as best as they can, try to do these online seminars and try to bring this discourse back to like Emirati society to say like, there is an alternative, like there is an alternative idea out there. But yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did. And again, it highlights quite well, I think, that in this case it would not be Tanfiz, because probably in the case of the UAE, and I would guess in the case of the Saudi Arabia, any risk of Tanfiz can lead to a genuine, or like to threats essentially to the regime. Like, at the end of the day, I don't want to repeat myself too much, but we are talking about, when we talk about the Palestinian cause, especially in our context, it's a cause for freedom, dignity, justice, etc., and those are not concepts that sit well with regimes that don't want any of these things. And I feel it's such an obvious thing, and yet at the same time, I feel it just needs to be repeated time and time again. I see a lot of discourse, quote unquote. Either I read them, or I see them, or I took part, whatever. I've just seen it a lot. Not understanding what the let me rephrase it. Like, again, thinking of the case of Lebanon, that, well, they allow pro-Palestine protests from time to time, therefore that must mean that, they are on the anti-Israel side of things. It's funny, recently I was asked this question, and you were there, of like, will there be any kind of normalization between Lebanon and Israel? And my answer was like, probably not, at least not anytime soon. But not because the Lebanese government doesn't want to, or that's not kind of the point. That's not how states or people in states usually think anyway, and government. It's more that as of now, the status quo just benefits the people who are in power, and especially Hezbollah, but the others as well. And as long as that's the case, I don't see anything sort of rocking the boat. And it doesn't seem to be a foreign policy priority really for the Americans or whatnot. I mean, Lebanon doesn't matter that much, to be honest. But like in terms of, geopolitics. So that would be the difference. Like if you stick to sort of the headlines, it can be confusing. If you just kind of dig deeper slightly, like not even that much, it actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, from the perspective of the authoritarians, you don't want to allow too much of it. You might allow a bit of it from time to time. And sort of like on this topic as well, maybe we can wrap-ish up before going to the book section. I just thought of this piece from 2020 by Sumaya Awad and Sandra Tamari from Mondevice, because they interviewed me. It was like a quote in the context of Lebanon, and the title it was of that piece, like, Palestine will not be liberated in isolation, a look back at the 2011 uprisings. And for me, this is sort of like, it's, I'm not going to say it's all I care about, because that's not true, but it's definitely one of the main things I care about when it comes to the relationship between pro-Palestine activism and the region broadly, even the world in many cases. But sticking to the region, I think we've made a good case, when I was not rambling, that like pro-Palestine discourse is actually very dangerous to these regimes, and they clearly know this, or else they wouldn't be cracking down so hard on it. And there is obviously a danger. You hinted at it, at least in the case of the UAE, for example, and maybe like listeners would know of a better example now in the case of Russia, and they see sort of this ultranationalism in Russia, and it's maybe very obvious. There's a symbol, the Z, and what have you. So it's maybe very obvious, especially because it's in the news. But my worry is very similar to yours. I definitely share these concerns. That at what point would this thing that's top down, that is imposed, at what point would become basically internalized, normalized, and to the point where what would in the past be at least nominally tolerated, if not sometimes encouraged, would actually be actively regarded as hostile. Maybe even if you are pro-Palestine, you may start being called a traitor. All of those things. At what point would that happen? Maybe on some level it's already happening, but we'll see, I guess.
I think in the UAE, we've reached that point.
Yeah.
Like we had, in the aftermath of the Abraham Accords, we had Emirati spokespeople on Twitter, like basically not like, it was just like the most egregious like anti-Palestinian rhetoric, and encouraging people in the UAE, residents and expats, citizens and residents, to report on people being pro-Palestinian, and report it as anti-Semitism. So like, just so ludicrous. Like, I think we've reached that point in some of these regimes. But I think that in my mind, what keeps me up, what makes me very concerned, is like people in the pro-Palestine camp facilitating this further. What do I mean by that? I mean, essentially, like, as I said already earlier, like, if we are not clear about where our allegiances lie, and I mean pro-Palestine people, but also Palestinians themselves, who is your allegiance to? Is your allegiance to the people of this region, or is your allegiance to the governments of this region? Is your allegiance to Hezbollah or Assad or Iran or whatever nonsense, or is it to like the dignified life of everyone around you? If we're not clear about that, if we obfuscate about that, we will make the internalization process much smoother for these regimes. And we are, to be honest, we're already doing it. We're already not being clear. Not only do we sometimes veer on the racism, we like, I'll tell you one example, and I'm sorry, I know that I'm rambling a little bit, but
no, go for it.
Burns me when I think about this. is that when I was preparing this, and I really want this to become a bigger project. And I'm hoping, inshallah, like this becomes a bigger project, maybe a book. I don't know. But I'm just so like energized by what I see in the Gulf, and I think it's valuable, and I think that it should be discussed because there are these like more progressive, maybe let's say on the left, but like generally pro-Palestine groups that don't fall into this binary campism as we've discussed. So it provides a good vision for the rest of the region. But when I was talking about this once in a group of activists, amongst them Palestinians and white people, they said, "What are you working on now?" I said this. I said, I'm preparing this manuscript. And a Palestinian activist laughed. And they said, "What activism in the Gulf? What do these people even understand activism? Like just complete like what, and I'm not claiming
that's a type of Shami supremacy that we see sometimes towards
Jesus, I
Khalijis.
know. It's so problematic.
Yeah.
But like it's not just the like it veers on the racism, but it's like also just like the chauvinism of assuming that your cause, as right and as unjust as it is, has primacy over any other cause in the region. That the Syrians should be like, okay, you know what? You're right. I should let Assad kill me because, he says nice things about you.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. I don't understand. So when we fall into this, we make the internalization process much easier and much easier for the regimes to say, these Palestinians and the people who support them are not out for you. They're really out for themselves.
Yeah.
And that just really worries me.
I completely share that. And in maybe in the case of Syria, it's obvious, or at least obvious to people who have followed Syria. What has been worrying me in the case of Lebanon is not the government doing shit because the government always does shit. It's not the government being anti-Semitic because it's always been anti-Semitic. It's not that, although obviously that does worries me for the various reasons that I'm anti that government anyway. But it's when certain things sort of cross the line that we supposedly usually, and here I'm being very broad and saying we, because I don't actually take part in this, but a lot of people in our world, let's put it that way, do take part in this. We tend, especially when we're speaking to Westerners, we tend to say very clearly that we make a distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I do believe many people genuinely do. I'm not saying they don't. But quite a lot of people don't. And when quite a lot of people don't, what worries me isn't those people specifically, but it's usually met with silence. It's usually met with, it's not worth doing, it's not worth... And I can give very concrete examples that are ridiculous and very insulting, but there you go. In Lebanon, since 2019 especially, there are so many examples. I'm gonna stick to 3 only. One was during the uprising. So I think it was October or November 2019. There was a sort of a sculpture in Beirut, in Martyr Square, that was a random sculpture. Like it just was a random geometric thingy. I don't even know what it was about. But from a certain angle from the top, and they noticed with the drone, there was like a drone filming the protest, it kind of looks like the Star of David. And because of that, the next day or something like that, the municipality of Beirut basically decided to remove it. Now, it had nothing even to do, like, it would be problematic if it had to do with the Star of David and they removed it because of that. But the fact it wasn't even that, but they had to do it, they felt that they had to remove it already, really bothered me. That was one thing. The second thing is there was, I don't remember the context, it was something stupid, like it was related to Trump, and Hezbollah's response to Trump tended to be as dumb as Trump's comments about Hezbollah. And so there was a protest it's not even a protest, it's like 5 people and they filmed themselves. And they were walking through, I think it was in Dahi, if I remember correctly, and they were dressed as Orthodox Jews. Like they had, they were dressed as, the people can look it up, I'm not going to describe it, it's very offensive. And the point of that is to say, like, if you support what Trump is doing, or I don't remember the context, and they were handing out fake pamphlets, and I think it was in Hebrew or something like that. I don't remember. But basically the point, like, if you're supporting what Trump is doing, you're on the side of the Jews, essentially. That's basically what they were saying. And the third example, and again, I'm highlighting top 3 here. There's so many more. But the third example is a very notoriously horrific MP, what the fuck is his name? William Wahab or something like that. He's like full-on Assadist, very, one of the most horrific politicians we have in Lebanon. He made basically a Holocaust joke in the context of the World Cup, and saying this is why he supports the German team, essentially. That's what he said. And so, again, it's not necessarily a numerical majority that thinks like this or that does this. For one, most Lebanese Jews were forced to leave in the 70s, so the experience of my generation, our generation, more or less, isn't actually direct interaction for the most part. It's just inherited stuff or, whatever. But it's there. It's really there. It's a problem. And most people, and I'm saying most people that I know, like circles of activists, i.e. people that I would expect a bit more of or from, tend either not to be silent about this or to actually be okay with it. And a final example is a few months ago, and see, I couldn't even help myself. I had to add another one. There's just so many of them. A few months ago, the Lebanese embassy in Paris invited a number of Lebanese Jews. So those mostly would be like, they have 2 nationalities, like the French and the Lebanese one, because they would be of the generation that left in the 70s for the most part, or 80s. And so it was just that, and it was a kind of a PR thing, like, look, we're nice, the Lebanese government was doing this thing and we're all equal, and Judaism is one of the recognized religious sects in Lebanon anyway, so they were just kind of playing their role. And they obviously, this was online and what have you, and you'll have a combo of people who were just very confused about it, because many Lebanese have no idea that Lebanese Jews exist. That's just an unfortunate fact. It's not like it's taught in schools or whatever. And you would have others who would see this as suspicious, like, oh, we're next, i.e. we are going to normalize with Israel next, because the Lebanese government met with Lebanese Jews in Paris, i.e. Lebanese Jews equals Israel. And when you make that, when you're already making those conclusions, when you're already doing this, what's the point of, like, Hasbara propaganda? Like, why? They don't need to do anything. They don't need.
You're doing it for them.
Yeah, we're just doing it. Like, what? They don't need to do anything really at that point. And that's in the case of Lebanon. It's already done, I think.
See, I mean, I'm not as familiar with the Lebanese context as you, obviously. So like kind of the viral videos and things like I have not come across, but I believe you, like that would be tolerated. Because I've seen it in other places. I've seen it in the way that sometimes people talk about American Jews and the conflation. But it's, I mean, on one level, I'm not talking about like diaspora activists, like that's a different matter, but like for people who live in the region, who have only had one particular interaction with a state that claims representativeness of Jewishness, it's hard to differentiate.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what, like, maybe, people can call me out if I'm being ignorant or point me in the direction of this, but like the pro-Palestine groups that talk about Palestine in political terms, I'm not talking like the religious groups, in Qatar or in the UAE, or anywhere, I have not seen any of those kinds of manifestations because it's not going to bleed into that. They're very focused on the colonial nature of the state and its role in American hegemony. Sometimes they link it to that or whatever. That doesn't mean that is not a problematic thing. And as I said, like the pro-Palestine activism more generally, I think you're right that it sometimes tolerates these kinds of things the same way that it tolerates very anti-Semitic actors like Hezbollah or the Houthis or whatever. Like there was like this clip on Mayadeen of like the Houthi representative or Houthi spokesperson.
Mayadeen is a pro-Hezbollah channel, we should say, to those who don't know.
Yeah, it's like this ridiculous channel of ridiculous humans. And it was just ridiculous because this woman, like, made up, like, very modern looking woman is like interviewing this Houthi rep who says the most egregious anti-Semitic crap. And she's like nodding, like seriously, like as if he's saying something reasonable. It's just ridiculous. And I know that happens. And then in the diaspora, I'm not saying everybody. I'm not even sure that this is a majority by any stretch of the imagination, but there is this conflation between being anti-Israel and being against settler colonialism, and then conflating that with American Jews. So like you'll have people be like, "You're normalizing because you're like on a panel with someone who happens to be an American Jew." Like, what are you talking about? This is not what like do you pretend BDS is something that's like your personal pet project that you just like apply the rules as like the way you want? And even BDS like has its like intricacies, and it's made up of humans that make up rules, and like what are you talking about anyway? So the same, I mean, it's I think a manifestation, that kind of tolerance is a manifestation of general tolerance of people who see pro-Palestine or like being pro-Palestinian or the Palestinian cause, let's say, as a chauvinism, which is why it allows them to tolerate. It allows them to tolerate those who use chemical weapons, and it allows them to tolerate those who use child soldiers, and it allows, you know what I mean? And as you said, what's the point of Hezbollah? Like, what's the point of having enemies with friends like these, really? Like,
that's really the thing. And I actually don't think this is off topic, because we are talking about authoritarianism. This is a version of it that actually facilitates the main authoritarianism that we were talking about. For me, like, I've always, and again, like, so quick context, although I've mentioned this in the past, so listeners already who have listened to those specific episodes already know this, but like I did my master's on the politics of Yiddish and Hebrew when I was at SOAS in London in 2015. And obviously I did this as a Lebanese, so I couldn't even bring them back to Lebanon. I was so paranoid. I'm not gonna take that risk, because in Lebanon, as soon as you are even suspected, like as if they can use anything, like you have a Hebrew textbook because you're doing research, or like anything that can be like, this is the country that banned Schindler's List, basically, you know, like anything really. And the reason they banned it officially, I should say, isn't because there were Jews in it, but because the final scene in Schindler's List, it was in Israel or something. I forgot. I've watched it a long time ago. But so that's the reason officially, at least, what they censored it. And I'm not gonna get into Lebanese censorship now. It's a topic. So because of this, I did my master's in this, relatives of mine have sort of come to associate me, and sometimes they would just say this to me, Lebanese relatives of mine, as like, I'm just trying to be provocative. Like, they would, like, I have an uncle who said, like, you're doing this to be provocative, aren't you? And some of them would kind of take it a bit further and basically accuse me in one way. Like, they won't say it directly because I'm like their cousin's son or whatever, you know, but they would kind of say it indirectly. That, you know, essentially, like, I have sympathies with Israel, or, you know, that sort of thing. Again, usually very subtle, in a subtle manner. And why? Because I chose a research topic, and that is the extent of it. And that's it. They never, obviously they were never interested in the research topic, you know, they didn't ask, you know, they were not curious about this.
Or the conclusions of that research topic. I mean, the anti-intellectualism of this.
Yeah.
I've seen this happen so often.
Yeah.
Like, one time I asked on Twitter, because I was writing a book review of Mahmoud Mamdani's book that had a bunch of factual inaccuracies. And he made the claim in the book, one of the claims he made in the book is that most Israelis don't care about Zionism.
Okay.
So I am not an expert on Israeli public opinion. I don't study Israel as a society. Mm-hmm. I study it vis-a-vis the Palestinian people. Mm-hmm. So I asked on Twitter, what, you know, does anybody have, is this polling even asked? Like, do people ask in Israeli polling about Zion, like, how do people identify? And the shit I got from left and right claiming that I'm a Zionist, I have Zionist sympathies because I'm asking this question when I'm writing a book review to refute this nonsense. And so it's just like the anti-intellectualism of it. It's like a fig leaf again.
It is, yeah.
To just control. I mean, when I go to Lebanon, I'm a Palestinian, but I'm born in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. So they're very concerned.
Yeah.
I bring my Palestinian, my birth certificate is in Hebrew, mm-hmm. But it has been translated and like authenticated by the Palestinian ministry. Mm-hmm. So I bring that. And then on the back of my passport, my American passport, there was like a little yellow sticker, mm-hmm. That they assumed was from the Tel Aviv airport. Okay. And so I get shit every time when I go to Lebanon, but I'm not, the couple times I've been, I haven't been that often, but like it's so like
And again,
it's so
this is a context in which not that long ago, a Palestinian in Lebanon, I'm not going to name so I don't get too much attention on her, just in case, but she was arrested and for like a month. And the accusation is that she had maps of Palestine in her house. And she's a Palestinian in Lebanon. So that in and of itself, like if you have a map from the 1930s, there's a good chance it might be in Hebrew, for example. There are just different things that, if you're not careful, honestly, they can, and it is in the context of Lebanon, although in Syria it's much worse, but in the context of Lebanon, it's like, on the one hand, they would allow certain books here and there. I've seen Ilan Pape's books, I've seen them in Lebanon translated in Arabic, for that passed the censorship, like that was fine, but then you have other books that don't pass the censorship. And you have movies that have nothing to do whatsoever, even with Israel, that basically get censored, etc., etc. So the reason I'm bringing up all this again is that just to emphasize again, and there is a sense, and this is a very strong one, that it's not just that we need to oppose, and here I'm being very general, like I'm generalizing, but it's not just that we need to oppose the state of Israel, but we basically need to stop thinking about the fact that there is a state of Israel. Like, we need to just not engage with that reality, like mentally, even on an intellectual level, in any way, shape, or form. In the meantime, the Israelis have like Arab studies stuff, and they study Arabs, and they have Mossad shit, and they're doing their homework in many ways. Whereas for us, it's even if we do want, for example, I did learn some Hebrew at some point. I do want to continue learning at some point. That in and of itself, at best, it's like it's like a question mark. Like, why are you doing this thing? And this would be followed with some kind of suspicion. If you're doing it, like in the case of Lebanon, the only place or context in which this would be allowed is if you are learning Hebrew in order to basically work for Hezbollah. Like, if you're doing that, they won't bother you really. You have some protection. And I remember, and this is very anecdotally, I was looking, basically jokingly, because I know it doesn't exist, for Hebrew courses in Beirut. There was a couple of them actually, but it was more like in the context like ancient Hebrew, so like say a biblical thing or whatever. And there was one at the university, but I wasn't in that, so I couldn't do it. And there was this other center that I found that I was told later on, because they only taught Hebrew and Farsi. I was told later on was basically just a Hezbollah center, and that was just very funny, because in that case I would be allowed to do it. I don't know which textbooks they use. I would be curious, but I would be allowed to do it in that case.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to change in career, you can consider it. But no, I mean, like it's crazy to me, the level of, as you said, like the use of the Palestinian cause to cover authoritarian tendencies, but the level of intellectualism around this stuff. As you said, they're doing their homework, and we're sitting here still talking like, why are you reading this Israeli historian?
Yeah.
Why are you? I mean, I'm not saying be an uncritical consumer.
No. Yeah.
But you it is ridiculous that we're in 2022 and you're going to claim you're going to claim somehow that the Israeli nation doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. Because it does. Mm-hmm. It does now. Mm-hmm. It does. They see themselves as a people. Mm-hmm. No matter how much you think it's ridiculous, that's what they think, mm-hmm. right? And they exist, and they have control over the territory. Mm-hmm. They have the land, right? And they have the power, and they have the guns. And it's silly to me why that is now a mark of some sort of, like you said, like some sort of suspicion, when you are trying to be just as rigorous as possible in your understanding and in your assessment.
There's a lot of I'm not specifically a historian on this specifically, or an expert on this, I mean, but I do know from some context that a lot of it started roughly around, I mean, not everywhere, but roughly in the late 60s, with at least the tendency of no longer, because obviously 67, the defeat, which we very, very euphemistically call the setback in Arabic, basically.
Naksa.
Yeah, Naksa, sorry, yeah. So like we very euphemistically call something that was clearly not just a setback as a setback. And almost since then, and Sadiq Al-Azam, I think, if I'm remembering the name correctly, he wrote a book on this as well, but a number of other people did as well. There's been this tendency of basically Like he would actually cite, I remember this, he wrote this in 68, I believe. He cited a number of papers, Arab papers, obviously like pro-government stuff, that would actually just lie about the victories and the defeats, and like basically downplay how badly the armies were doing, essentially, in that 6-day war. And I do think, I'm not going to say like it started then, or maybe it probably started before. There was a tendency that was just reinforced after that. I'm not sure. It's very difficult to do a concrete timeline on these things. But that tendency continues in one way or another. It probably has taken different shapes of form. It's 50, 60 years is a long time. But I feel like there is that problem, and that problem definitely reinforces the view of, let's put it this way. If you are a propagandist for the, like in Emirati pro-UAE normalization with Israel stuff, what have you, your narrative is pretty straightforward. It's a lie, but that doesn't matter when it comes to propaganda, obviously. You have to just repeat it a number of times and make it pretty in lovely TikTok videos and what have you. But it's, we love diversity. We are, they allowed a rabbi, I believe, in the UAE, for example, et cetera, et cetera. This is the narrative, you might say it's hypocritical, et cetera. I would agree with you when you say it's hypocritical, sure. But this is the narrative. What is the counter narrative to this? I don't see a very good one. This is the problem. Like, if you are being very basic here, because I know this from experience of many friends of mine who are Jewish, American, French. Some of them would have the Israeli citizenship, most don't. Usually, double nationalities and what have you. Your politics don't actually matter, as long as, if you want to go to Lebanon, you can go as a Jewish person. In and of itself, you can, but you cannot, like, it's not a neutral thing. Like, you're not going there. It's not like going as a Christian or as a Muslim. There is this added layer that you will have to take certain precautions. I know friends literally who basically just didn't say to anyone that they were Jewish, that they just went there. And at the airport, one of them was asked, and she actually said that she's Christian. Like, this happened. And this does happen a lot. It's just, again, people don't want to talk about it usually, but it does happen a lot of time. And we don't talk about it. But when it does happen, and when it is filmed, basically, and obviously spread on social media, usually spread by Israeli media or what have you. Memory is an American one, I believe, but they're very known for doing these things. We don't care about how it looks, because maybe we don't agree or we just don't think it's important. But actually, those are the videos that spread the most. Those, again, the Hezbollah one I mentioned, where they dressed up as Orthodox Jews, the hilariously badly done propaganda video that they released about a month ago of them skiing in the mountains and shooting at random targets and doing judo for no reason, like very ridiculous stuff. Those things spread like they go viral all the time in those circles. And if you are on the other side and you're not a critical person, which, spoiler alert, most people are not, and they, this is just the story that you see, the story makes sense. It's internally coherent, I mean. It's like, they hate us because we're Jews. And here are a shit ton of evidence that proves this. And there isn't enough counter, like if you think of it just as like propaganda tactics, there isn't enough on our side, quote unquote, those of us who are opposed to anti-Semitism, who are critical of Israel, all of the boxes, I would say, of an anti-authoritarian, let's put it that way. There just isn't enough of it. For me, it's just that simple. And I think it's because we're badly organized, we don't have the resources for it, there are many, many reasons for it, but also because a majority, or at least, again, I don't know if it's a numerical thing, I don't know if it's like 51% or more, but like a lot of people are okay with it, or at the very least just don't think it's a problem, or are, the vocal minority that are actually anti-Semitic and those things. And so it creates a very toxic environment in which, even if you are, and I know many Jewish friends have gone through this many times, and even on this podcast we've talked about this a number of times, even if you're pro-Palestine, like if you're an American Jewish person who's pro-Palestine, for example, the sort of things that you have to prove essentially is much higher. Like the standard, almost like the things that you have to, the suspicion that's automatically associated with your identity is something that you basically have to work on in a way that if you're not Jewish, you just don't have to. And this in and of itself, for me, bothers me a lot. And it's not just an Arab thing who do this. Like I had Cindy Milstein on recently, and they spoke about how even in anarchist circles in America, like, you know, mostly white people and brown people and black people, non-Arabs, have said anti-Semitic stuff towards them, for example. You know, like, this is a problem. It exists. It's there. And it bothers me when we don't recognize it. Because it isn't just that it bothers me in and of itself because anti-Semitism really bothers me. It's not just that, but it's also because it actually empowers the worst kinds of people all the time, because you're just giving them what they want anyway. You're just giving it on a gold tray.
Well, yeah, it empowers the Israeli propaganda machine, but it also cripples you. It cripples your movement, because it leads to this anti-intellectualism, and it turns people in on themselves with the, you know, trying to sniff out anybody who is not ideologically pure in, you know, quote unquote, in some way. And I don't know what the term is in English, but it's like takhween, like we're constantly
like you're accusing everyone of being a traitor or
being
whatever.
traitors. And it's I mean, it's super ludicrous, that kind of infighting. So basically, what your discussion brought up for me is like how it turns inwards and has an impact on organizing inwards. Obviously, the merits of what it's doing, you know, vis-a-vis outside audiences is also bad. Not just, as you said, because you are morally like against anti-Semitism, but like even strategically, like what this looks like. But I guess I've never really, like, my consideration, whether it's with this research or just generally, when I think about what audiences, I'm really focused on the Arab audience. And I leave, perhaps, and maybe this is a blind spot on my front, but I leave the discussions and what American Jews or what, you know, Jewish people around the world, like outside of Israel or whatever, because I think Israel is very specific. What they think, I leave it, I think, to a different set of activists, or like I leave it to discussions amongst themselves, almost like how they view things. It almost feels like it's not as pressing, because in my mind I'm like, oh, the Palestinians are the ones that are being subjugated, and then the Arab regimes are subjugating Arabs around them, and that's the dynamic that I was focused on. But if you're thinking about, as you said, like pro-Palestine activism, particularly in Western countries, then this dynamic is really, really very pressing. Not only because of, as you said, how it looks, but how it's impacting the movements internally.
I mean, it really got.
I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. I mean, again, it really got to the point where, in my case, when I was living in the UK, and this will sound dramatic, but I assure you, it's not. I mean, I assure you, it's like justified. But I got to the point where, when I would see at a protest a white person with a keffiyeh, I would have doubts, like just automatically, like you probably have shit politics. And the reason for that is just experience. There's so many cases, and I would see it sometimes with white people who are like pro Kurdistan or what have you. You would have these dynamics from time to time. And for the record, I am very much pro Kurdistan, but I'm saying specifically in the dynamic of, like, you know, using the aesthetic but not really caring about the cause or the people or what have you. And I would see this definitely in the context of Palestine. I remember very clearly, and this is anecdotally, but this happened a number of times as well. And I was there for 4 years. I was in Edinburgh, so in Scotland, and there was something going on in Israel-Palestine. I don't remember what exactly. It was 2018, early 2019, something like that. I mean, there's always something going on. And there were a bunch of people who were distributing pamphlets and whatnot, and they were like white, and they were all wearing keffiyehs. There was four of them, usually a bit elderly. Anyway, the reason I mention this is because I spoke to them and whatnot. They were nice, you know, and at some point they asked me, so like, do you have a connection to Palestine? I said, yes, actually, I'm actually part Palestinian, blah, blah. Okay, but we got to chat and everything. And like, it took, I don't know, 30 seconds for like pro-Assad shit to to just come out immediately. It was almost, there's almost like a pipeline at this point, because again, in the same way as I just said this, if you are a pro-Emirati normalization, propaganda, whatever, if you're on that camp, you can benefit right now from an internally cohesive or coherent rhetoric. Like, we are diverse, look, the UAE, so many people are there, everyone can shop, you know, whatever, that kind of stuff. And, you know, you have this, you can benefit from this, and you can just expand it by including Israelis or the Israeli state within that story. So it kind of fits that. But on the Assadist side, it's also internally coherent. Like, look, all of the other regimes are normalizing with Israel, but not the Syrian one. We are the only ones who are remaining. Look, we support Hezbollah. We have the Iranians on our side. You know, it has a lot of internal contradictions, but the ideology has a way of filtering all of these things out. And it's internally coherent. So you have a lot of people after 11 years now since the revolution and the counter-revolution in Syria, who have been following a certain kind of media especially. You have those thought leaders essentially in many circles, especially on Twitter, but also on Facebook and other places. They have been repeating sort of the same thing over and over again. Like, they would be outraged whenever Israel does something, and whenever Assad does something, Assad is good. You know, just those things at the same time. You do this time and time and time and time again. At some point, people, even who are well-meaning, would I'm saying like Westerners, white people, whatever, would genuinely think, and I've had people genuinely tell me this, like, not with any kind of toxicity or what have you, but actually telling me, like, what this was a question I got, like, what can we do to support the Syrian resistance? By which they meant the Assad regime. They did not mean the Syrians fighting the Assad regime. They meant the Assad regime. And so this exists, and this is a problem. It's probably not a majority, because I don't think the majority thinks that you know, because it's kind of a conspiracy way of thinking anyway. But I do think we have a problem with conspiracy theories in our world. We have a problem with anti-intellectualism. I think you nailed it when you said this, really. It's a real problem.
Misinformation.
All of these things.
So one last question for you,
Sure.
because I'm going to flip the tables here for a second. Would you say that I'm accurate in saying that the way that pro-Palestine activism falls into these kinds of pitfalls is more common in the West than it is maybe in the Arab world, or am I wrong?
No, I do think it is more common. Common, and also because there is a dimension.
Because it's hard to like face the lived reality right in front of you in the Arab world, right?
Exactly. And in the Arab world, like, I do make the distinction. I don't like it, but I do make the distinction between, for example, my grandmother, who just says al-Yahud, and she doesn't think much of it because she hasn't met a Jewish person in like 60 years maybe. She's from, I should say, like, she's not Palestinian, but she met my grandfather in Palestine, and they both left at the same time. So she has that context and that background in the back of her mind, but she's actually not like she's much more bigoted against Syrians, for example, than she is against Jewish people. But she would still do this. She would still say this. You know, it's just and so I do make that distinction. I don't like it, but I do make it because I know of that specific context. And what I do when I see it more in the West, and I can mostly speak to the context of France to some extent, but especially the UK and the US, at least from what I've seen. There is also the added dimension of traditional leftism, anti-imperialism, quote unquote, the fact that the US state supports the Israeli state, and so there is the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of crap. You know, there is all of that. And it's very easy to, if you kind of start from that, to find enough people from our world who will echo your thoughts. And so you won't have to feel like you won't be accused of not listening to local voices, because you will find some local voices who are pro-Assad. You know, you won't be accused of all of these things because you can stick within certain circles and echo chambers on social media especially. You can stick within that world. And the only reason why I pay attention to it is because I know I have some mutual. I was in that world before and I kind of grew out of it. But I see mutuals. So I see lots of friends, lots of people that I know. Obviously, I won't name them because I don't think they're bad people or anything. Who may not know that this other person has denied the genocide in Xinjiang or is pro-Putin, or, may not know this, but only know that person or that group or that whatnot because they've, said stuff about Israel. And so they only know this aspect of them. They don't know these other things. And because of how the algorithm works on the internet, you may never know about, Xinjiang or Putin or what have you, because it won't pop up, because only Palestine or Israel stuff will pop up on your timeline. And so you would only know this aspect of what they're saying. That's kind of a generalization, but I've seen this a lot. And it happens a lot in student circles, in student movements. It is an actual problem, not just because you have pro-Israel lobbies, what have you, saying that, how do I say this? The fact that you have ill-meaning people saying it's bad doesn't mean it's good. We have to make that nuance. They will probably exaggerate. They'll probably take it to a different extent. They use it themselves to hide what they are doing or what their government they support are doing. That is true. If we cannot, if we are unwilling / unable to make those distinction when we should be making them. And I should say, by the way, that I actually think in the context of the US, I see less of it than I did in the context of the UK and in Europe more generally. I don't know why exactly. Maybe proximity, maybe the Holocaust, maybe there's a number of different dynamics going on. Also, American Jews have a more of a culturally visible presence than you would have in most of Europe. In the sense that in America, I've been seeing a lot of interesting parallels between Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, different other groups actively making the links with pro-Palestine activism, while also making the links with Black Lives Matter and that sort of thing. And they are the ones who are bridging those worlds, essentially. They are the ones who are making the case for intersectionality, for looking at the Palestinian cause as a decolonial cause, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas in Europe, for the most part, it's not that obvious. And a lot of Europeans, especially European politicians, don't basically support Israel as a way of saying that they are not anti-Semitic. That's just a dynamic in Europe that you don't have in the same way in America, although you kind of have it a bit. But in Europe, it's just very, it's in your face. I mean, Germany is very obvious as an example, but other European countries like France does this a lot, for example, and so on. France, you'll have on the one side, maybe I'll stop on this because I'm rambling a bit, but France, you'll have on the one side politicians who are pro-Palestine, but who deny France's complicity in the Holocaust. At the same time, those two things at the same time, because it translates itself into a chauvinistic or a nationalistic, or it changes a lot from context to context. And part of the problem online is when those contexts are kind of mixed with one another, and you sort of think that anyone who has a Palestinian flag or is waving a Palestinian flag must be on your side. If you start from this premise, you will have good people on your side, and you will have the most horrific people on your side as well. You just, if you're not being critical on that front, then I think it's inevitable.
I think you're right. I think in certain leftist spaces, being pro-Palestinian is easy.
Yeah.
It's not the controversy. You're not pinpointing your valor or your high degree of moral, virtue by being pro-Palestinian. Which makes it difficult because, as you said, it's a wide tent, and it encompasses people who are using Palestine and people who genuinely care about the Palestinian cause, not just as some sort of proxy for their anger at their fathers in the American establishment or something.
Basically.
You know what I mean?
Basically. The point isn't that my problem actually starts with the fact that when we talk about these tendencies, actually starts from the fact that anti-Semitism really bothers me. It bothers me as just on a human level, and it also because I've been studying the Holocaust for quite some time now, and the horrors that happened there are for me something I'm just very sensitive about it, just in general. Not that I'm not Jewish myself, so I don't claim that, that's not the case, but it bothers me a lot. So that's where I start from. And through that priority, if you want, the red flags are very easy for me to spot. I just see them. It's very easy for me to see them. At least it's let's say it's a red flag with a question mark. I have to investigate this further. And this, it's sometimes it's a term used. Sometimes it's silences. Silences say a lot. People who have no connection to Palestine personally, but who are very, very passionate and vocal and what have you when Israel does something. but may have nothing to say about when their own government says something. You know, a lot of things, and I don't want to go into the whataboutism things here because it's also a slippery slope. But I know a lot of people who are not active on anything really, who have nothing to say about Egypt, and they are Egyptians, I mean like Egyptian Americans or what have you, or who have nothing to say on other contexts, suddenly feel very passionate when Israel is bombing. Usually when, you know, it's very specific and when it's in the headlines. And I'm not going to criticize this too much. Like, it's complicated and some people start that way. And so I just maybe see this as an opportunity to also invite them to open up their world even more. You know, that's not my problem. I don't have a problem in and of itself, but it's just very obvious when it's very loud on something and then it's very silent on something else that's either happening at the same time or happening right after or what have you. And I'm not accusing people of like not knowing everything all the time. That's not the problem. But it's just in specific contexts, especially when it comes to kind of, we probably have similar worlds in some sense, like our circles, different circles, you know, that sort of thing, where there's kind of this intersection between leftism, being pro-Palestine, you know, that sort of thing. You would have people tolerated or even normalized in these circles that are doing actual damage and hurting people, like especially emotionally sometimes, but in some cases physically, as in they've put activists in Syria, you know, at risk, you know, that sort of thing. This has happened many times. And I would know because I would be in these contexts. I'm not even talking social media. Like I was at SOAS, you know, university in London. I was there. I saw people interact. I've been in different conversations. And I would see the difference between when Palestine is brought up and when Syria is brought up in these same circles. And including by Syrian Palestinians, by the way, who, for obvious reasons, are anti-Assad and also anti-Israel, or anti-Israeli government. You know, like they for them, it's very normal to make these links. As I mentioned before, many Syrians activists, it's very normal for them to make these links. They've been doing this for a long time now. In many ways, it precedes the Assad regime anyway, which came into being in 1970, not before. Have two plus decades before that, for people who don't know. So it's like that, but for them, it's very, so for Syrian Palestinian friends, it's very organic in many ways. But they would see very clearly the difference between when they're complaining about one government and when they're complaining about the other government. And it has actually alienated a lot of them. And I've been in situations where I know if a good friend of mine who is Syrian Palestinian from Yarmouk, as in he grew up in Yarmouk, I don't remember where his family's from in Palestine, but he told me like at some point he stopped associating himself with Palestinians in London specifically. And because of that. And because for him, especially in 2015, 2016, like Syria was on his mind a lot and he wasn't seeing that priority reflected in the people around him. And this
No,
is what
that
bothers
kind
me.
of demobilization and that kind of alienation is exactly what's on my mind. It's possibly a new research avenue that I'm thinking about because it has alarmed me so much. Like exactly. And the pro-Palestine activism that I describe in the paper, like as I said, like it's a trajectory, and that's why I find the activism in the Gulf so refreshing
Yeah.
because it doesn't veer this way. But as I said at the beginning of this, like I'm not claiming one single trajectory. So the people who might be loud on Palestine, they're well-meaning. That could be an opportunity to inform their worldview further in that direction. But unfortunately, in the West, I think it has been bastardized.
Yeah. I would say in Lebanon as well, but yeah, in the West especially.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I mean, on the note, there is kind of a segue here because we're talking about anti-intellectualism, but one of the ways of tackling anti-intellectualism is to read books. What are 3 books that you would recommend to our audience, and why those 3?
Yeah. So I'm gonna recommend 3, possibly 4. I'm sorry,
It's fine.
books. The first is I think it's being translated or parts of it has been translated, so I apologize. But like Azmi Bishara's المجتمع المدني was I think really fascinating for me to kind of restructure my assumptions about civil society, particularly in the Arab world. So I think, as I said, I think either it's being translated or parts of it has already been translated.
So the
It
title in English is just Civil Society. I mean, the
yeah,
translation from the Arabic, I mean, yeah.
yeah, civil
Yeah.
society. And then there is this book I was reading. I just recently finished called Joyful Militancy: Building Thriving Resistance in Toxic Times. Kind of like an anarchist perspective on tolerating difference, but but like using it effectively, and not, not falling into kind of like supposed ideologically pure stances and the kind of campism we talk about always. And then, so sorry, I might have to give 4 books. I apologize, but there's Queer Palestine and the Empire of Critique by Saad Atshan. It's about LGBTQ pro-Palestine activism, or Palestinian LGBTQ activism. And again, it talks about this kind of double policing, like both from Israelis, like as you said, like people who like the Israeli government, the pro-Israel crowd that might utilize these kinds of movements for their own nefarious purposes, but also from the left and also from, other supposedly allies. I thought that was a really fascinating look. And finally, there's this one called Contested Modernity by Omar Al-Shehabi, about kind of the history of like the formation of Bahraini identity and nationalism in the context of colonialism. And he presents, like, I think an interesting, like he provides an interesting linkage between kind of colonial practices and what we see in Bahraini politics today. Not so much related to the Palestine perspective, but I thought it was really, really fascinating.
That's cool.
So.
I as I said, I do want to do a Bahrain episode at some point, so maybe I'll use that as part of the research. Okay, well, Dana, this went longer than we thought, but I think it's more than justified, given that, I mean, at the end of the day, this isn't a small topic, and I feel like we've done our best to give it justice. But thanks again for coming.
Thank you for having me.
The Far East Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/FarEastTimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.